This is where it's something that I think a lot of people don't know about the U.S., given that we are the oldest continuous modern democracy, right, in the world, that the United States does not have an affirmative right to vote at the national level. So there's no place in the U.S. Constitution that says every U.S. citizen has a right to vote.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news, and opinion from arts academics at the University of Auckland.
Kia ora koutou, ko Julianne Evans aho. I'm Julianne Evans, the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts, and today I'm talking to Associate Professor Jennifer Frost, a historian who focuses on US history, and in particular voting rights, youth and civil rights movements, and just for something completely different, Hollywood gossip in the days of Hedda Hopper. Welcome, Jennifer, and thank you for coming to chat.
Thank you. This is lovely to be here.
Now, you've just published the paperback version of your book, Let Us Vote, Voting Rights and the 26th Amendment, published by New York University Press, which looks at the voting rights in America of young people over 30 years and all the efforts required to get the voting age lowered from 21 to 18. How does your book fit into all of that?
Thank you. Well, I started this book, in fact, because of contemporary political events. So it was in 2014, I teach a course on the 1960s in the United States. And I was doing my last lecture for the course on legacies of the 60s. And the night before the lecture, I realized, wait a second, didn't young people get the right to vote coming out of the 60s? And in fact, they did. In 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18 for American citizens. And that gave the right to vote to 18, 19, and 21-year-olds across the nation. So why I was thinking about that is because we were seeing how challenging the political system in the United States was. And that was even before Trump had declared that he was running for president in 2015. But it was clear that we had a polarized politics. And what was really lacking was youth engagement. Given that all the problems of the 21st century are going to affect young people far more than any of us sitting around this table, we know that they need to be engaged. They need to be having their voices heard. They need to be able to articulate the issues that are important to them. And young people disproportionately are involved in demonstrations, in organizing, in all sorts of other ways, but not as much electoral politics, both voting and running for office. And so given that we live in a democracy, both here and in the United States, that is the way to have your voice heard, is to participate in the political system, as well as demonstrations are important, organizing is important, but we need to vote, we need to run for office. So thinking about that, it made me realize that I want young people in the United States to appreciate that the right to vote wasn't just given to them. It wasn't just handed to them. That in fact, young people of earlier generations had struggled and fought and organized to get that right to vote. And that they wanted young people to participate in our democracy. And in a way to be sure that young people appreciated that vote and did everything they could to use it. One thing I learned, though, in writing this book is that often young people do want to use their right to vote in the United States, but that it is incredibly hard to use that right to vote depending on where you are. And this is one of the problems with the U.S. system, is that it is locally and state controlled in most ways. Who gets to vote, how you vote, when you vote. And so in many places, it's very hard. Governments, local governments, county governments, state governments make it quite hard for young people to vote. So one of the things that I learned about was not just, I want young people to appreciate that they have the right to vote. I now appreciate the hurdles to young people voting, and they shouldn't be blamed for that. So it was good for me to learn that.
Yeah, because you were looking at one area of the book that was really interesting to me is college students who are going out of town to go to university or college and who are in place there to vote not being able to vote in that town. Is that how it worked?
That's right. And that goes back more than 30 years. So, in fact, even for 21-year-olds in the United States, they could be in their senior year of university, say, and they wouldn't be able to vote because they are not in their hometown in the place they grew up with a family address. And so you see, really, even starting as back as early as the 1930s and 40s, even 21-year-old university students saying, I can't vote here and I can't get home to my parents' house to be able to vote in this election. I'm being disenfranchised. And so that existed. And I remember there was a law even in New York, and we think about New York as very liberal and open to voting rights. But in fact, in the 1960s and 70s, there was a law that explicitly said if you are living somewhere because it is for education, you cannot vote there. And for a lot of small college towns or university towns in the United States, there are places where college students outnumber local residents. So places like Berkeley, California, places in Massachusetts that have a number of small colleges all in one place. And for local residents, they are saying, we're the ones who are here. We don't want these fly-by-night students coming and voting and taking over our city government. So it's been quite a tug of war. And that is still an issue in the United States today, where it's quite hard to get an absentee ballot. It's quite hard to vote from wherever you are in many, many states. And so that's another way in which I would argue the youth vote is currently being suppressed in the United States.
And is there a low turnout for youth voting generally? Is it across the board quite low?
That's right. So that's been one of the most interesting recent developments is the youth turnout has exponentially increased. So right after the 26th Amendment is passed and ratified in 1971, there was the 1972 presidential elections, and that was a high point. So definitely young people realized we've just gotten this right, we're going to take advantage of it, and they voted. After 72, though, it is a decline. And it declines until you get these peaks. 1992, when Bill Clinton was elected the first time, you get a peak. 2008, when Barack Obama is elected for the first time, you get a peak. But then something changes with Trump. So in 2018, which is a midterm election, Trump had been in office for 2 years, we see a spike of youth voting. Then they spiked again in 2020. And in fact, in 2020, Biden got 61% of the youth vote and Trump got 36%. Wow. There is no doubt that the youth vote made a huge difference in these, what we call the swing states, like Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, made a huge difference. But they've kept voting. So that's the thing that's interesting. It used to be that young people really only came out during the presidential year. 2018 was a midterm. They came out in 2022 as well. And they stopped what was supposed to be a red wave of election. And it was supposed to be the Republicans winning across the board. And it was young people who stopped that. In response to that, many in the GOP, including Ted Cruz, as well as some of these media figures like Jesse Waters of Fox News and other candidates, saying we should raise the voting age to 25 or 29 or make young people take a civics test where they would have to test their knowledge of U.S. history and U.S. politics. Because the GOP is recognizing they don't have an agenda that is going to mobilize and motivate most young people to
vote for them.
So rather than changing their agenda to maybe think about, young people are concerned about climate change. Young people are concerned about democracy. Young people are concerned about economic justice and racial justice, police brutality. Instead of changing their agenda, they are choosing to suppress the vote among young people.
And can they do that legally? Can they actually suppress the vote?
Yes, you can in the United States. So this is where it's something that I think a lot of people don't know about the U.S., given that we are the oldest continuous modern democracy, right, in the world. that the United States does not have an affirmative right to vote at the national level. So there's no place in the U.S. Constitution that says every U.S. citizen has a right to vote. What it says is that states control that, who gets to vote, right? The qualifications for voting, when, where, et cetera, they can vote. And then there are some amendments to the Constitution that we call the suffrage amendments. They are the voting rights amendments. And the first one we got was the 15th Amendment, which was after the Civil War, which enfranchised African American men. Then we get the 19th Amendment in 1920, which enfranchised women. And then we get the 26th Amendment, which enfranchises all citizens 18 and above. But what the wording is, it doesn't say we're enfranchising these people. It says you cannot deny or prohibit the right to vote on the basis of race, sex, or age above 18.
But you can do it some other way?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So back in the 19th century, as a way to disenfranchise African American men, the southern states put in laws that said your grandfather had to be voting to allow you to vote. Well, very interestingly, if you've just fought a war over slavery and enfranchised and freed 4 million African Americans, their grandfathers were not voting because they were enslaved. So it was a grandfather clause that allowed disenfranchisement. There were also very famously poll taxes where you had to pay a tax to vote, which also disenfranchised poor white Americans as well, and things like literacy tests. Well, literacy tests were delivered by county local officials, and what some white Americans or Southerners would have gotten would have been a fairly straightforward literacy test. And then African Americans would get a test that required them to read and interpret some convoluted legal statute. So literacy tests, we know, were used to disenfranchise African Americans disproportionately. So it does open these. And then for youth, it opens up things like residency that we were talking about earlier, that you have to have lived somewhere for 3 months, or you have to be working there, or you have to have a driver's license from there. So these other mechanisms have been used to disqualify people from voting.
What do you think? Are there ways to get around that? Are people winning on that front?
Litigation around voting rights has absolutely exploded since really, I think, about 2010. So after Barack Obama won in a landslide in 2008, it was a very exciting moment for those of us who support the Democratic Party and support, I would say, democracy in the United States. It was a very exciting time. And it was feeling that we're on a roll and we're going to be able to make all these changes, and a new generation and a diverse coalition is going to be able to achieve all these changes. But 2010 was an election, and that was what we would call a backlash election. And because the backlash against having an African American in the White House, a backlash against healthcare, which we had a healthcare legislation that was passed, which for New Zealanders would be absolutely nothing, minimal. But because that passed, we get a backlash against that. And so in 2010, Congress gets just taken over by Republicans, but so do the state legislatures. Right. And 2010 was a census year. So the state legislatures were able to use the census to then what we call gerrymander their states to benefit Republican voters. And so since then, 2010, we've had all sorts of litigation on both sides to fight back against gerrymandering, fight back against these voter suppression issues. And unfortunately, in 2013, the Supreme Court undermined a crucial voting rights piece of legislation from the 1960s, and which only opened the door to further voter suppression, gerrymandering, et cetera. So the 2010s and continuing today, there's a flood of litigation. Interestingly, voting rights advocates who want more voting rights, not less, win cases disproportionately because it fits the law. But it's just a constant battle.
And it must cost a lot of money.
Costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time. And for example, right now there's at least, I think, 6 cases that are around youth voting rights. One of the cases in Idaho is making the argument that students should be able to use their student ID. So their student ID from high school if they're 18 or from university if they're above that to vote, because many states and localities have, you have to show an ID. We do that here too in New Zealand. But what happens in the U.S. is they limit what form of ID is going to work. And so many people don't have a driver's license. Many people don't have an official ID from the state. And you have places like Texas where you can use your gun license as your ID, but you can't use a student ID to vote. So these are these kind of mechanisms that on their face you would say, oh, it's just a bureaucratic matter, but it's not. It's done deliberately. So in Idaho, we have voting rights advocates for young people who are pushing back against that. And one of the things they're arguing is the 26th Amendment is being violated here with the fact that they can't use their student IDs.
And then you get Trump himself, for example, who will never give up saying that he won the last election.
Well, that's a big problem because we do have what are called election deniers in the United States that deny that President Biden and Kamala Harris won the 2020 election. What's so fascinating about this, and I can't help but raise this, is that these Republican election deniers never comment on the fact that everybody below Trump who was a Republican won their campaigns, won their elections, and they're not questioning those victories. So the very same ticket that Trump is claiming is claiming was stolen from him, all these other Republicans win. And nobody's ever saying, wait a second, if Democrats wanted to steal the election, wouldn't they have just stolen it completely and, gotten rid of people like Mitch McConnell and taken over Congress and taken over this?
I think it's because it's not logical.
That's right. They don't see that there's a contradiction there. And that is scary because this election denying is a way of denying some 81 million voters for Biden-Harris their votes, their rights to vote.
In terms of the book, coming back to that, there's a lot of information in there. How did you find all that out? Did you go back to America? Yeah, I know that's where you're from. Did you take the opportunity to do that? Or?
Yeah, thank you. I did an early trip, and that was fantastic. I went to the Library of Congress, the National Archives, and I did research mainly on the East Coast. And then when I was going to finish the research, COVID hit. And so I wasn't able to go. And this is where I have to say, being here in New Zealand and emailing these archivists saying that I can't get there, people came through. And they photocopied materials for me. They searched and found amazing materials. But the other thing is I was able to interview people. And because of Zoom, because of the technology, I was able to interview these Americans, older Americans who had participated in what's called the youth franchise movement. And it was fantastic. And I would have loved to have interviewed them in person, but it worked fine to do it by Zoom. So yes, I was able to collect everything that I needed, more than I really needed, and was able to write the book. One of the reviewers said that the book goes through the struggle to win youth voting rights with painstaking detail, which is not a compliment, or it's a backwards compliment. But I immediately said, okay, I guess I could be defensive about this. But I actually purposely did the painstaking detail because what I wanted to demonstrate was, again, that point I started with. The youth vote wasn't given to young people. Young people for 30 years struggled, organized, wrote letters, campaigned, had vigils, lobbied to get the right to vote. And I wanted to see that. And they were shot down again and again. I mean, defeat, defeat, defeat. And they kept on. They persisted. So I wanted to tell a story that says you don't give up the first time you're sent back, that change does take a while. Social change takes persistence and takes patience. The other thing that I think is amazing, though, is when the tide turned, when the moment was right for them, and they didn't see it coming. You can't see the future, but they were ready to go. By having done all that legwork, by having done all that groundwork, when the momentum shifted and the political moment was there, they were able to hit the ground. And so what I do say to my two children who are 19 and 23, and all their friends, as well as my students, is you have to maintain hope. You have to keep struggling. You do the work. Keep doing the work, because you don't know when the time is going to happen, when you hit it perfectly and you actually get something you didn't expect or that you had been working for all this time.
Fantastic. Who is the book for? I mean, it looks like it could be for anybody in particular, but is there someone it's aimed at, do you think?
Thank you. I did aim it for my students. It's dedicated to my students, past, present, and future. I had 3 summer scholars from the Faculty of Arts who did incredible research for this book. Couldn't have been done without them. And it's aimed at them, and it's aimed at my children. So I tried to write it in a very accessible style, short chapters, short sentences, trying to have a bit of some characters and pace. And I must credit my colleagues in the Faculty of Arts, Paula Morris, who is a wonderful short story writer and editor and reviewer, and Helen Sword, who is also a wonderful writer and teacher of writing. I took different sessions with them, and I must credit you, Julianne, because of the media that we have done together and your editing, which I know the first pieces I wrote for you were covered in red track changes, and I think they've gotten easier to edit as time's gone on. So I've had wonderful tutoring and mentoring in trying to write a different kind of style. So this book is written differently than my earlier books. And anyway, I hope it finds its audience.
I'm sure it will. And where can we get it?
I think you claimed it's at Paper Plus. It's also available for sure online. It's in ebook, hardback, and as you said, paperback, just new in 2023. And I would love to have people buy it and read it.
Okay, I'll remind them again. It's Let Us Vote, Youth Voting Rights and the 26th Amendment, published by New York University Press by Associate Professor Jennifer Frost. Thank you so much for coming in, Jennifer. It's been lovely talking to you.
Thank you. I appreciated the time.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts by following us on social media.